All right, so Corey is uh, the president of Ratio Christi, which means he's my boss's boss or something like that.
That's good
Um,
papers.
and basically in charge of our national organization. Has a lot of experience with uh, sort of counter Mormonism stuff. A lot of experience actually with countering critical theory and those sorts of things, but also wrote one of our booklets, one of those booklets that we hand out at the tables on Is Christianity Good? And so that's why I asked him to speak to us today. So because there's sort of this thing, right, where people today, there's sort of this saying that people aren't so much interested anymore of whether or not Christianity is true. They're interested in whether or not it's good. So thankfully, it is both true and good. And Corey's going to tell us why. So I'll hand it over to Corey, Dr. Corey Miller, and we will go from there.
All right. Now, let's see. Uh, can you see the slides? Am I doing this right? Still
Yep.
good? Okay. So you know what Ratio Christi is? Great. As John said, the three books on the left are on Mormonism. Seventh generation Mormon, Joseph Smith's bodyguard, or one of them, was my ancestor. And as one person said, he wasn't doing his job. So converted from Scottish Presbyterianism, but you've got there leaving Mormonism at the bottom, why four scholars changed their minds, co-authored with the former BYU professor. The one in the middle is the most recent, Unmasking the Mormon Missionary Message, written by myself and a pastor in Utah. We were both former pastors, former professors, former Mormons, but the six authors that contributed to it were all former Mormon missionaries who served their full 2 years. And it's the first attempt by anyone to systematically take on the Mormon missionary discussions. So if you're ever meeting with Mormon missionaries and you want to know exactly what they're going to say on Tuesday night, how many times they want you to inhale or exhale, what they want you to feel, that's the book right there. And then the other one is just kind of Mormonism 101 tactics for evangelizing them up on top. Dissertation, Aristotle, Maimonides, and Aquinas on the good life from the fall to human perfectibility. Got that in a book form, In Search of the Good Life. And then one that was based on a debate that I moderated between William Lane Craig and Alex Rosenberg from Duke University, moderated it here at Purdue. And that is Faith in God Reasonable Debates in Philosophy, Science, and Rhetoric, which had half a dozen atheists, half a dozen Christians contributing to it after the debate from the fields of rhetoric, physics, and philosophy. So tonight, Christianity, good or bad for the world? Now, I got canceled, cancel culture from the second oldest Canadian university, the University of New Brunswick, about a year ago on this topic. I was invited in to give a public lecture. It was going to be this, and they said, "Oh, that's too controversial." That is controversial. It's asking a question. It's not even making a statement. So they wanted me to change it. So I added some philosophical words in there that made it sound high and falutin. Only philosophers could understand what it meant. So only philosophers would show up. And it was moving forward. And about 2 days before I arrived, had my flight in hand and everything, one student Googled me and found that I was an ethics professor at Indiana University, had a former pastor as a student who had turned gay and charged me with creating a suicidal environment. Had to get attorneys in on that one. I got exonerated. I had two atheists defend in my class defend me, and that was written up about in articles, media, things like that. He Googled me. That was enough to scare the philosophy department that invited me to the public lecture. And so this talk that I'm going to give you here, I was canceled on last year. So you can Google Corey Miller, this topic, or canceled at University of New Brunswick. You can find the story. Um, but Steven Weinberg, he was one of the ones I invited to debate at, or to, yeah, to debate William Lane Craig at Purdue University many years ago, back in, I think, like 2014-ish. And Weinberg was a physicist, Nobel laureate. And I tried on a website, I went for the top 50 atheists on this website. And one by one, they kept rejecting me. I mean, I went for Stephen Hawking. I went for Leonard Mlodinow, the founder of string theory. Sorry, Leonard Mlodinow was Stephen Hawking's co-author for a couple of books. Leonard Susskind, I went for him too. He declined. Steven Weinberg declined. Finally, I got to Alex Rosenberg, which was number 13 or 14. But I went through Peter Singer and so forth. But Weinberg, who passed away just a couple of years ago, is a Nobel laureate physicist. And he said this: the world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion can and should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization. So when you guys are thinking from mechanical engineering or biology or entomology, what would be your greatest contribution to all of the earthlings here before Elon Musk takes us to Mars? He thinks it's to get rid of religion. He's a physicist, and that's what he thinks. That's hardcore. Well, the the imprint of Jesus here is unmatched in history. Whatever you think of one's evaluation to the question, is Christianity good or bad for the world? This seems indisputable. Um, he's the greatest mark of history out of any worldview, out of any philosophical or religious movement. A man earning a PhD and speaking 8 languages by the age of 22, Yale historian Jaroslav Pelikan minced no words in his introduction to his book. Regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about him, Jesus of Nazareth has been the dominant figure in the history of Western culture for almost 2,000 years. If it were possible with some sort of super magnet to pull up out of that history every scrap of metal bearing at least a trace of his name, how much would be left? Now, that's a real historian, not a physicist. And he's saying this guy is unmatched. His imprint is unmatched in history, whether religion, whether philosophy, whatever. He's been the biggest mover and shaker. He bears he merits the justification to be examined, to be researched, to be considered. Well, Harvard psychologist, New York Times bestseller, Steven Pinker, writes this book called Enlightenment Now. And it's so influential that billionaire Bill Gates writes up at the top, and I put it over to the right there so that you could see it. My new favorite book of all time. This is an important book. This volume is an apologetic. It's the case for, the apologetic for reason, science, humanism, and progress. Now, before you think progressive, that term could be dicey, but just think progress. Think you guys are all in the hard sciences, unless another student has come in. The three of you I was introduced to, all in the hard sciences and in engineering fields. Progress. Um, he seems to offer, though, a somewhat revisionary history compared to the work of Jaroslav Pelikan, an actual historian for a lot of the things that he's saying. He's basically saying human progress, the reason why the West is best. Want to make America great? Go to reason, science, humanism, and progress. That's why it's great. We need to get back to the Enlightenment. And that's his message, is that reason, science, and humanism, the key themes of the Enlightenment, have led to mass progress in almost all areas of life. And no doubt they have. We have to admit that. He asserts there are best means to continuing the progress into the future. And so he thinks that these ideals, reason, science, humanism, aren't consistently upheld, and they're often under attack. So he calls for people to fortify, to defend apologetics against the counter Enlightenment enemies of religion on the one hand, so he hates religion, and socialism on the other hand. So when you think progressive, again, what you're seeing right before your eyes is the second ideological revolution in the universities. It's a progressive revolution, but not all progressives think the same. I've got a book coming out later this year called The Miseducation of America, from confronting the cultural revolution from the classroom to your community. And in it, I show that everything that we're experiencing right now came from the universities. Politics, culture downstream, upstream is education, and at the apex is the university. Well, as we'll see later, Christians started the universities. But what happened? Cultural revolution, or ideological revolution number one, scientific naturalism, 1880, 1930. Came in, kicked out the Christians. You had to go start Calvin and Wheaton and Biola and other schools. We lost Harvard, Princeton, and Yale, and the rest was history. Revolution number two, postmodern cultural Marxism, other end of the university, the humanities, the social sciences. They both want to say they're progressives, but one is part of the left, the other part of the new left, and they don't get along very well. So, when we think about the goodness or badness of Christianity, that's not our full concern, right? Um, we shouldn't believe something simply on the basis that it's good or it's useful. And it is certainly relevant, though, especially in the era of where Christianity's critics claim that Christianity is not only false, that was Richard Dawkins and the new atheist, Steven Pinker would be among them, but that it is harmful, it's oppressive, it's it's wicked, the enemy of human flourishing. And so showing its net good creates the plausibility, at least, for its veracity, especially now if we can, if the reasons for its goodness connect in some deep way with its truth claims. Okay. So we must admit Christians have been guilty of harm, of evil in the past, but we don't want to ignore that. But at the same time, we also have to say, to be fair, that a lot of the malicious actions that are done by professing believers, they may or may not be done by true believers. They could be professing believers. What about the Crusades? What about the Salem witch trials? What about that Christian who went and raped that woman or killed that small child? Okay, right? First of all, were they a real Christian or just a professing Christian? I can claim to be a dog, but that doesn't make me a dog. In today's postmodern era, you might think otherwise, called furries. But for most people, common sense, no, that doesn't make you that. But even professing Christians who are actual Christians still sin. They might be saint sinners, but they're still sinners. And you've got that bumper sticker that says, "Oh, Lord, save me from your followers." I think we all can sympathize with that. We've seen hypocrisy inside the Christian church, even by genuine, real Christians, not just professing Christians. So we need to admit that, but we also need to say, look, regardless, these professing or actual Christians aren't the same as the Christ to which they profess. We would call what they do as hypocrisy, dividing profession from practice, not doing what you say. It's hypocrisy, right? You got to throw the mud on Jesus, though, if you're going to get rid of Christianity. Okay, that said, there is the existential question about God. Does God exist? We're familiar with that. But the axiological question about God addresses the question of what value, impact, if any, that God's existence does or would have, supposing God did exist in our present world. And you have two antithetical answers or postures toward that axiological question. The protheistic and the anti-theistic side. The protheistic side obviously says that yes, God's existence does or would add value to our world, and atheism says no, it wouldn't. And so one way of approaching this question then is to look out there at the flora and the fauna and find as many goods um, that you can value, or that we value, goods or values that are widely embraced. Aristotle would call this generally accepted opinions, or GAOs, that most people would say, yeah, that's a value, that's a good. We call that good. And you would say then that that good could not exist apart from God's existence. In other words, God's existence entails that good's existence. It cannot exist otherwise. A more modest approach is to say that it could, but it wouldn't likely, and in fact, it didn't come into being through that. And so and that's going to be our approach here. We're taking a more modest approach, okay? Most in the West don't realize the strong heritage in the West that we have. Why is the West best? In its most best ways, right? The representative government, not tyranny, not mob morality, um, you name it, education or compassion, whatever. Why is the West best in many of those ways? Secularists like Pinker point to the various goods that made the West best, and yet they fail to see that Christianity offers the inference to the best explanation, that it has greater explanatory power and scope, underwriting the existence of these various goods. And so such people are, in essence, I would say, living on the borrowed capital of a Christian worldview, just as Steven Pinker is doing when he waxes eloquently from the fruitful perch of Christendom's first university in the New World, Harvard, 1636. Once the Pilgrims offboarded, within a decade to 3 decades, they started Harvard. And so if the Christian God exists, he would make a substantive difference being added, bringing added value to the world. And so we're going to look at some of these widely affirmed values or goods whose most prominent manifestations I think are best explained by Christianity. So, what is good? Jesus asked Pilate what is true, but we're not talking about that right now. We're talking about what is good. Um, think about good um, as we do typically, it's often an exclusively moral notion, an ethical notion, but it's broader than ethics. You can have metaphysical goods, you could have practical goods. Take, for example, health, human health. Aristotle starts this out when he explains in the Nicomachean Ethics what the good life is for humanity, and that's the subject of my dissertation. What constitutes good health is neither subjective nor relative. Health is an objective notion, and it provides some normativity, some oughtness in terms of how humans should behave in order to flourish as healthy human beings, like having diet and exercise and proper sleep and so forth. Well, artifacts are like this too. Um, Take a pair of scissors, for example. You say, what makes a pair of scissors a good pair of scissors? We're not talking about a moral good there, or really even a metaphysical good. Um, a good pair of scissors is good when it cuts well, when it functions properly, the way it was designed to function in the mind of the artisan. It's an artifact. A dollar bill is an artifact. So when considering various goods, then it's important to distinguish between something that is good for us versus something good that is good to us. The first is objectively good, the second is only subjectively good. The former is desirable, the latter is simply desired. It's like a preference, it's aesthetic, it's a taste, or it's a orientation. Think about sexual orientations. Not all orientations are good. I may have an orientation for many women. I may have a sexual orientation toward an animal. I may have a sexual orientation toward a number of things. It doesn't make them desirable. It just means that's what I desire, right? And so it's a happy occurrence when the subjective desires align with what is objectively desirable for me. What's the good life for a human is not the same as what's the good life for a horse or the good life for an acorn. How does it become a grown up, fully developed, mature acorn that is an oak tree? You talk about photosynthesis, you talk about water, you talk about nutrition, nutrients, and soils. The good life for a human requires certain things that are necessary, not just optional, that are necessary. So going back to health, then, you guys probably are not parents yet, but you have parents, and they probably tried to stuff your face with a bunch of broccoli. And they said, eat your broccoli, eat your greens. You said, no, yucky. And they said, no, it's good. No, it's not good. It is good. It's not good. It is good. It's not good. And so it's relative, right? Well, it matters what you mean. To me, I mean to my kids, broccoli is good for you, objectively speaking. It's desirable if you want physical health and human flourishing. It's got a lot of protein. And they think, no, what's good to me is cotton candy. But you give them a diet of nothing but cotton candy, one kid, and the other one broccoli, it's not going to take long before you see objective human health is going to follow suit with the one who eats the broccoli, not the cotton candy. Okay. So, what's good for me? What's good to me? And we want to look at desirable goods as a clue to what is true. Being and goodness are the first principles in theoretical and practical reason. Aquinas brings these together: theoretical reason and practical reason, being and goodness. So let's consider a couple of things. Think about Jesus again. Think about notions of prosperity. Everyone wants to prosper. And we'll look at responsibilities of persons and look at societies, whole societies, even systems. Systems can be good, right? Systems that are helpful, instrumental to human flourishing are desirable for our good, and ones that aren't are not, even if they're desired, right? Ones that detract from it are not good. So while absent from the minds of many, Jesus impacted economics long before it was a thing. Pinker he talks a lot about capitalism, the capitalist enterprise, as the greatest means to human prosperity, as a civilizational good, and shows how capitalism has helped to lift about 4 to 5 billion people out of abject poverty, not just mere poverty, but abject poverty. And he's right. He's got a lot of data, but there's data and evidence, and then there's interpretation and explanation. And those things are not the same. He's got great data and evidence, but poor, paltry explanation and inference to the best explanation. So he mentions our buddy Adam Smith, but he fails to give credit to where credit is due. The father of modern capitalism, capitalism not being a term used by Smith, but used by Marx as a pejorative term, much like Christian wasn't used by Christians, but by their enemies initially, the Christ ones, the followers of Christ, and we took it as a badge of honor, or Protestants who thought of themselves as reformers, but their opponents said that no, you're just protesters, you're whiny crybabies, so they took it as a good. Fine, we're Protestants. So you have capitalism, Marx's term. You had the wealth of nations. The subtitle is, or the full title is, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes. What causes wealth of nations? This is a book everyone should read, or at least listen to on Audible. You probably shouldn't read if you don't want to commit suicide, because if there is a science to economics, this is definitely it, and it is boring. But it is a mammoth book. It was published in 1776, kind of an important date, right? But in it, he, who was a moral philosopher, came up with capitalism or free market system. He talked about the invisible hand of God to reveal the brilliance in the working of the free market systems, where someone might produce something, a producer, and set a price, and someone else might come along as a consumer and want the product, and they agree upon a value exchange to which they're both happy. No government forced them, no tyrant came in. They just traded goods and they were both happy. It was like an invisible hand of God, and everybody was doing it, and not a lot of regulations. And suddenly everybody was happy, and everybody's making off like bandits, and the whole pie seems to be growing. Well, 1776, we got in a big war in America. And after a little while, the Americans won. And this big book came over the boats from the Atlantic. And all of the founding fathers started getting it, reading it, Alexander Hamilton, others. And before you knew it, America was off to the races, and it would become, for the rest of its existence until now, the most wealthy nation in the history of the world. And as of today, today is the highest the stock market has ever been. In the last 2 years, it's grown by 30%. If you had stocks, if you had $1 million in there, you've now got 1.3 million after 2 years. Today is the highest it's ever been. Pretty amazing. But one part of it, in this invisible hand of God, there's this famous statement that is made. It is not from the beneficence, the love, it's not from the beneficence of the baker, the butcher, or the brewer that we get our dinner at night. Rather, it is from self interest. The restaurant owner is not doing it out of the goodness of his heart. He wants to make a buck. He's got self interest. Now, atheists like to say that's why Christian ethics is bad, because they've got bad motives. You're all, what's in it for me, rather than just doing it because it's the right thing to do. So I'll admit, I don't want to go to hell. When I first left Mormonism, I heard about hell for the first time, scared the hell out of me and heaven into me, I tell people. I didn't want to go to hell. Well, that was selfish. Or was it? Maybe it was just self interested. It certainly was self interested. I don't want to go to hell. But you know what? That's also not just my desire. It happens to align with what is desirable objectively for me for the good life. That's not how I'm designed to flourish. I'm designed to flourish in heaven, to know God. And so God doesn't want me to go to hell. I don't want to go to hell. And when the desires and the desirable match up, that's the good life. Knowing God, the knowledge of God, that's the purpose of life, Jesus said. And so it happens that my desires mapped onto what is desirable. And there was this value exchange. Grace through faith, and boom. John Piper says, God is most glorified in me when I am most satisfied in him. The book Desiring God, what was it called? The Desires of the Christian Hedonist, or something like that. The Confessions of a Christian Hedonist. I love that. I love that statement. And so a century later, sociologists were apt to try to explain this phenomenal growth of the wealth of nations, the wealth in the world now. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, most of the world was still in extreme poverty. That was not a long time ago. But now billions have been lifted thanks to capitalism, or better term now, the free market system. And still billions more were brought out through charity. And so Pinker likes to credit this to secularism. Yet his Harvard colleague and department head of economics today writes the book Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. So an actual economist takes on Steven Pinker when he's talking about capitalism and economics and what made the West best. And this guy said, no, it has to do with religion. He defends the vital role of Christianity in the birth of capitalism, even if the contemporary scene has long since divorced itself from its origin. The contemporary scene, you might say, is living on borrowed capital. Something like Francis Schaeffer would say. The contemporary scene, like not Meyer, he's behind me on a different book. Steven Pinker is trying to saw off the very branch he's sitting on. His nice perch at Harvard was what we Christians founded, and this guy tells how it was even affordable. So Pinker demurs concerning Marxism, remember socialism, as a system of social good. And granted, it's disputed by Marxists, but in terms of objectively bringing people out of poverty, it's an observable fact that credit goes to capitalism, not to socialism. No Marxist leader ever took his own poison. When the revolution occurred and the dictatorship of the proletariat, you all know how this works, right? The workers of the world unite. So you go from, feudalism to capitalism, and then it's supposed to go to socialism, and then to communism, and then you're just in this great utopia, and the Beatles sing about that. Imagine. The whole song is a gospel. He's an evangelist for communistic Marxist utopia. Well, look, when the revolution starts, you guys need someone to lead you. So we're going to lead you. And after we get rid of the bad guys, like the priests and the nobility and the royalty to the guillotine, then we'll lead you. Marx and Lenin loved the French Revolution. They said that was the best. Um, until Robespierre ended up getting beheaded by his own situation. And in a moment, I might talk about how that was Dawkins. Dawkins creating it at the height of new atheism. But no Marxist leader, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Castro, Pol Pot, Kim Jong il, or the like, they never lived in the same tents of squalor like the people that they claim to liberate. They all lived in their nice palaces. But that's what you're supposed to do during the dictatorship of the proletariat. But after a while, it'll just slough off, and everybody, will each have a Toyota Corolla, and all have an iPhone 15, and we'll all have a living wage, equal pay for equal work, and everyone's going to be happy, and no one will want to compete because we're all good people naturally, and it's just society that makes us, evil and competitive and stuff like that. And so we just fall into this communist utopia. That's the idea. But the reality is they all killed 100 million of their own citizens, not counting their enemies. So, from Marxism's socialistic impetus of non charitable, coercive, statist redistribution, from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. Hey, that's right there in the book of Acts. Not quite. Jesus modeled giving by giving himself voluntarily, not coercively. And the early church followed, and down the line through history, followers follow. Genuine ones do. They gave to the poor via voluntary charity and so forth. And Marx, despite his Judeo Christian heritage, did not follow. We might say that Jesus was the more faithful Jew of the two Jews in the tale of two Jews to Judaism there. Um, and so there's been abuses in capitalism, no doubt. You read Das Kapital, and during the Industrial Revolution, it was kind of sad, and the heart starts to bleed, and you want to just go give people stuff, and everyone's entitled to stuff. Um, but there turns out despite those abuses, um, which began in the English world and then Marx caught on to, the proper usage, not the abusive usage, has revealed great fruit and even spawned certain human virtues from self-interest, not selfishness, not the same thing. And among those are innovation. We come up with new things like the computer that you're looking at. And we try to develop it even further to compete. I got an Apple, not a PC, and excellence. And then because of that, there's a reward at the end. It's a dangling carrot or an apple or maybe some cotton candy, but an apple. And for hard work, I get certain wages. And the more I work hard and the more I innovate and I become a little creator and innovator, there's something at the end of it for me. It's the invisible hand of God. It's self-interest. And John Wesley said, earn as much as you can so you can save as much as you can so you could give as much as you can. And it turns out, in a Christian viewpoint, work is actually not just a means, an evil means to an end, to a weekend, 40 hours for a weekend. I'm living for the weekends, or for a 2-week vacation, or for retirement, and then I die. No, Monday through Friday can be great. In fact, before the fall of man, Adam's work was considered workship or worship. It was not just an occupation, it was a vocation. And so the great sociologist Max Weber comes along from Germany, observed the correlation between the Protestant and being involved in business. His book was called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, such that the notion of a spiritual calling or vocation, vocos, for Protestants shouldn't be relegated to just the missionary and pastor. Part of the Reformation tore down the veil between priest and parishioner. To have a calling, to have a full-time job for Jesus, you don't just have to go be a missionary or a pastor. You can be a farmer, you can be a businessman, you can be a general, you can be a king, you can be a tent maker or a homemaker. And so the Protestant Reformation spiritualized, going back to Genesis, this notion of calling, the Protestant work ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Every member a minister. And so he argues that the modern spirit of capitalism, sees profit as an end in itself, the pursuit of profit is virtuous, but Protestant offers a concept of the worldly calling and gives it a spiritual character. The common caricature of capitalistic greed doesn't necessarily apply when grounded in the Christian ethic of love and treating one's workers well. The worker is worthy of his wages. We work as though we're working for the Lord, Paul says. The man who doesn't work doesn't eat. Work is a good thing. We're supposed to work, and it's a good thing even before the fall. But paying our workers is good too, not exploiting our workers. Everyone's now happy and they're going to be harder workers. And it's just a value exchange. You work hard, I pay you better. Jesus, now, not secular humanism, is the greatest motivator when it comes to charitable distribution of wealth in history. It doesn't take government. Voluntarism is what came in even before government for North Carolina. And as a Jew, he embraced the sanctity of human life, a high view of humanity, a provisional Christian humanism, whereby property ownership was a matter of stewardship. The Communist Manifesto says you can summate Marxism or communism as abolish private property. In critical theory, it might be abolish whiteness or maleness or heteronormativity or whatever. But here we say private ownership was a good thing, and for us, it's a matter of stewardship. We are God's managers. And he taught about our responsibilities owed to others. I don't owe this computer anything. I don't owe this light bulb anything. I don't owe this table in front of me anything. But I owe something to all of you, and you owe something to me. He taught us and he demonstrated the highest form of love. Christianity is the biggest movement in history, and followers follow having substantial value impact on civilization. And it's almost predictable downstream. The compassionate Jesus community emerged very early on, and that's recognized by even the most ardent atheist. Take Princeton moral philosopher Peter Singer. I tried to get him to debate William Lane Craig. He wanted $25,000. And I was like, no way. I'm not going to pay that because then I got to pay Craig that too. I'm a missionary. I can't do that. I visited his office at Princeton. A Jewish atheist like Steven Pinker, a Jewish atheist like Karl Marx, a Jewish atheist. And in his book, The Unsanctifying Human Life, like Nietzsche before him, he recognized something. We have killed God. What will we do in its wake? If we have killed the sanctifier of human life, we have killed the sanctity of human life. You can't have the sanctity of human life without a sanctifier. He's very consistent with this. And he says, the doctrine of the sanctity of all human life and the seriousness with which the killing of any member of our species is regarded mark off the Christian ethical and cultural tradition from almost all others. The very many different societies have seen no moral objection to abortion or infanticide is, I think, well known. And look at our society as we become godless, we have less of God, we're starting to push infanticide. Even if we restrict our attention to infanticide, the list is endless. Plato in the Republic, Aristotle in the Politics proposed that the state command the killing of the deformed infants. We find nothing resembling the Christian doctrine that the lives of all born of human parents are sacred in the pre-Christian literature. There can be no doubt that the change in European attitudes to abortion and infanticide is a product of the coming of Christianity. And then you follow another Jewish atheist, Yuval Harari. He's part of the World Economic Forum. He's over there in Israel. New York Times bestseller here. Sapiens, in a brief history of humankind. And look at that right below there. I would recommend Sapiens to anyone who's interested in the history and future of our species. Bill Gates, another Jewish atheist that Bill Gates loves. According to the science of biology, hey, two of you are biologists. People were not created, they evolved. And they certainly did not evolve to be equal. The idea of equality is intricately intertwined with the idea of creation. The Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity, which argues that every person has a divinely created soul and that those are all equal before God. However, if we do not believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, souls, what does it mean that we're equal? Evolution is based on differences. There's no such thing as rights in biology, no such thing as liberty in biology. You have another atheist, Michael Roos. He was another guy who I moderated a debate between him and Yale Divinity School's John Hare on God and morality. And then he contributed to one of my books, Is Faith in God Reasonable? Roos died last year, sadly. He said morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth, considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something. Ethics, it's just an illusion. I appreciate that when someone says, love thy neighbor as thyself, Bible verse, they think they're referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. You can watch my video when I sat down after the debate and we did an open dialogue with tea on couches. And I had this book that I raised up to Michael Roos, brought it up in my ethics class as a grad student at Purdue as well. Started getting prank calls at 3 o'clock in the morning that night from colleagues in my class mocking me for my faith. It's a book called A Natural History of Rape, a biological basis for sexual coercion. And I lifted that up and it's on YouTube. And I said, Michael, you believe rape is wrong? Of course I do. Is it objectively wrong or just subjectively wrong? Subjective, like flavors of ice cream. You like chocolate, I like vanilla. Or objectively wrong, wrong for all people at all times. Objectively. Where do you get objective morality, Michael? You wrote, and I quoted this for him, and you can watch the YouTube to find his answer. Well, what about Christian humanism and organized charity? So we've looked at Jesus' impact on the world, goods that are like prosperity, capitalism for entire systems that have lifted humanity, the responsibility of persons, that we owe something to other persons, not to abstract objects or physical concrete ones, and societies. But now, what about Christian humanism, Jesus humanism, not secular humanism, Steven Pinker humanism, or Yuval Harari humanism, and organized charity? Far more impactful than secular humanism is Christian humanism. When the abortion issue, for example, is brought up, it's common in our society to hear people say that who are, they say about pro-lifers who are the most prominent defenders of life, you're just defenders of pre-life. Life begins at conception and ends at birth. How about you care for the poor? How about you care for everything after pro-life? You're not really whole life, you're only pre-life. But nothing could be further from the truth. There are 600 Planned Parenthoods, and the former president of it just died yesterday. And, well, she didn't die. The blob of tissue died, named Cecil. The collection of cells died, named Cecil. And et cetera, et cetera. In any case, 600 Planned Parenthoods that offer health and services in addition to beheading, ripping off limbs, and burning alive babies that can feel it as sentient beings. Yuval Harari sapiens. Homo sapiens are sentient. They can feel pain. And that's mixed with women's health. And we're told that this is all healthy. Now, there are 600 of those Planned Parenthoods, but there are 3,000 centers that offer genuine women's health and only women's health, and not a mixed bag of women's health and the Grim Reaper, who offer to help mothers and their babies long after birth. Numerous churches step in and help. Given the Christian impetus toward life and loving the poor, it's not surprising that the Christian community is responsible for twice that of the general public when it comes to adoption. Who adopts? The Christians are the ones who adopt all those other kids that the critics are saying, how about you help all the poor people or allow us to have abortions because you guys won't help us? We are helping, we're the ones doing the adopting. Now, critics should also consider, just think about the place where you were born, unless you popped out in a hot tub or, a doula helping, your mother do it the natural way. You were probably born in a hospital, and you may have gone to COVID or gone to a hospital during COVID. And you look at the name of the hospital, and you got St. Elizabeth Presbyterian Hospital, St. Jude Methodist Hospital, St. Mark Good Samaritan, Eliezer Hospital. Why is that? Why aren't they called Richard Dawkins Hospital? Why aren't they called Ibram X. Kendi Hospital or Yuval Harari Hospital or Bill Gates Hospital? Isn't that weird? Hospitals were invented by and exponentially multiplied because of Jesus's apprentices following the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. The idea of hospital rose not at a bachelor's degree as degree in hospitality and management, tourism management. No, that's a bachelor's degree now. The origin of hospital came in the 4th century. The building of St. Basil's Hospital in the city of Caesarea, the Roman Empire. Basil the Great was a theologian, a monastic leader, a church bishop, and one who had his own sufferings. And so he pathos. He came up with the first hospital. A mere accident of history. It's a fact of history. Are hospitals good? Oh, yeah, they are. Well, the Christians invented them. By accidental? No, I think it's connected deeply to the DNA. Followers follow. Today, inspired by Christ, the largest disaster relief organizations in the USA, with operations around the world, like the American Red Cross, Salvation Army, Southern Baptist Convention. Not only were they founded by Christians, but they continue to be staffed predominantly by Christians and given birth to global movements. They work in tandem together. Every hot meal served by the Red Cross in the USA is prepared by the Southern Baptist Convention. The largest child relief and adoption organizations are likewise Christian, like Compassion International. And the same can be said for anti-sex trafficking movements as well. Not to say secularists aren't involved with those, but they almost never found them, and they're never primarily or predominantly populated by them. America has become the most prosperous nation in history in the world and the economic mothership of philanthropy, of organized charity across the globe. Notably, America is among the most heavily influenced by Islam, by Hindu, by Buddha, by atheist, by Christianity. Well, let's talk about private charity and the mere mentality and how that's predictable with respect to charity. Beyond institutions, when it comes to individual charitable giving, on average, conservative Christians are the most charitable. Next is liberal or progressive Christians. Next is conservative secularists. And last of all is progressive secularists. And by conservative, I mean those who tend to see the Bible as God's word, the need for personal conversion, and taking the apprenticeship of Jesus seriously. That's all I mean by conservative Christian. Ironically, they're more charitable, according to the data, for secular causes than are secular people. And this goes beyond mere monetary giving to other commitments like the giving of blood. So you have one professor who's now at Harvard. We're spending a lot of time on Harvard here. He was at Syracuse for 30 years. 30 years. in philanthropy. By his own reports, he was liberal, I think a nominal Catholic background. But in this book, who really cares? America's charitable divide. Who gives? Why it matters. The surprising truth about compassionate conservatism. Well, he did a study in the USA, in America, in Canada, and he was converted. He couldn't believe the data. He had to keep going through it and through it and through it to get the right interpretation to make sure he wasn't off somewhere. And he writes, in years of research, I have never found a measurable way in which secularists are more charitable than religious people. Gives a ton of examples. Religious people were 25 percentage points more likely to give than secularists. Religious people were also 23 points more likely to volunteer. Religious people who per family earn exactly the same amount as secularists, 49,000, gave about 3.5 times more money per year. They also volunteered more than twice as often. He says people who pray every day are 30 percentage points, 30 percentage points more likely to give money to charity than people who never pray. The churchgoer will be 9 points more likely than the secularist to give to non-religious charities, 25 points more likely to volunteer for secular causes. On and on and on and on. He goes on to say that even one's view, one's mentality, one's perspective on the role of government on helping the poor is predictable. If you have a strong government view with respect to the poor, you will give less. If you are more of a skeptic with respect to government's role on helping the poor, you will give more. It's the data. There are anecdotal individual cases, but it's the data. One interesting one, I won't bore you with all the facts, but I remember following this back in 2020. The Democrat, Trump was running at the end of his term. Democrats were running 27 candidates, and Biden ends up winning. Among all those 27 candidates, Biden and Kamala ended up being the second and third worst, with Kamala giving virtually nothing until she ran for vice president, and Biden just at like 1.4%. The mentality of many progressives is that you need to help the poor. How? By voting it in. Government needs to help the poor. What invariably happens, according to the data, is people who have that mentality will give less. The only person out of all 27 Democrat presidential candidates that gave more than, I think, 4% was Cory Booker, 10%. Biden and Harris were beat out only by Beto O'Rourke, who is 0. But it's part of the mentality. If you have a big government mentality for this, you're going to just assume the government's going to do it. And so this whole business of finding out what motivates people, why people give, matters, because people will give less charitably if they think it's the government's responsibility. There are individual exceptions, but this is according to the data. Now let's move on and talk about individual rights. And I could say, by the way, just to back up a little bit, they've got, due to biblical convictions, Christians excel in baby making, right? Christians love to have sex, but they infuse it with a theological understanding of family, not merely sociological. People who were raised in a church, even if they don't attend now, are more generous than those who never regularly attended, according to Brooks' data. And so Bill Gates, who endorsed the Pinker book, who embraced Yuval Harari's book, whose foundation gives millions to charity, claimed in his 2014 interview with the Rolling Stone magazine that he believed in God's existence, that he was raised in church, and that at least at that time before his divorce, he and Melinda Gates were raising their kids in church, even if they don't quite understand what faith is or its value. That too makes a difference in the motive structure of why we do what we do. Dawkins' most recent book that talks about the divine spy camera theory. He hates to admit it, he says, but Religious believers give more because they think someone's watching over them. Okay, fair enough. But the motive structure matters. Now we get to human rights. What of human rights? Well, the Holocaust comes across right around World War II, and the attempted genocide of the Jewish people provided the major impetus to not just give them a piece of land, but the human rights movement. And so in 1948, a year after the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the year that the nation of Israel was birthed after 2,000 years of it being birthed before that, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the UDHR, we see that humans have a special moral status. Where does that come from? We remember what Peter Singer said about the unsanctifying of human life. It demands the recognition of the inherent dignity of and the equal and inalienable rights of the members of the human family. Oh, that term sounds familiar, inalienable. But the grounding of this intrinsic dignity is universally shared by humans in virtue of their being human as such. And it's because such rights are owed to human dignity that it's inherent and that they are likewise inalienable. Now, not by accident, I'm claiming that the supreme architect behind the UDHR, Harvard trained PhD in philosophy, former UN Secretary General, was Charles Malik, a devout Christian. So this notion of inalienable rights that we find in the Declaration of Independence 2 centuries earlier, the state can't take it away because the state never gave it. It's something transcendentally endowed by our Creator. It's why all lives matter, including black lives that matter, and white lives and polka dotted lives, only because something's been endowed by the Creator. Otherwise, they don't matter. Peter Singer was right. The white lives don't matter. The black lives don't matter. The polka dotted lives don't matter. It's Nietzsche for all. Bring in your tanks. The Uberman, survival of the fittest. And so this modern notion of human rights didn't emerge in a vacuum. You don't have the right to do what is wrong. Why? You don't have the civil right to do what is morally wrong, is the idea. Like modern capitalism, it has deeper historical roots deriving historically from natural rights, whose concept is derived from natural law and further derived from eternal law. And so James Griffin, in his book On Human Rights, says that the French marked the secularization of the concept by changing the name from natural rights to human rights. They secularized the notion that we are left with at the end of the Enlightenment is still our notion today. Its intention has not changed since then, a right that we have simply in virtue of being human. But remember, the difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution was God in or God out. God less. Kill the priests, kill the nobility, kill the royalty. And Marx and Lenin loved that revolution. That was their ideal revolution. They tried to do a 10-day work week. Why? Because while we can have planetary motion give us 365 days a year and 24-hour days, what gives us 7 days a week? The Bible. They were trying to get God out. They didn't want human rights connected to natural, that then before that came from natural law, which came from eternal law. So they just call it human rights. From whence comes human rights? So few documents have provided as much platform for freedom and human flourishing as the U.S. Constitution. It gives pride of place to the Bill of Rights and there to the First Amendment. John Quincy Adams is reported to have said that the highest glory of the American Revolution was this, that it connected in one indissoluble bond the principles of civil government with the principles of Christianity. Our constitutional Republican form of liberal democracy, we have at the heart, this idea of freedom, designed to preserve rather than to curtail human freedom, given the Christian insight on human persons. We're not mere blobs. We're not mere matter. Matter can't even explain free will, right? Biology sucks to be you, biologist, because you depend on chemistry. Sucks to be you, the chemists, because you depend on physics. And chemistry and biology are just slaves to the laws of physics. Dominoes just fall as they will, and you can predict their following because you knew the laws of physics and antecedent conditions. But there's something that's recalcitrant, this notion of human persons, human agents, free will, a soul that violates determinism. It's this idea that we have freedom, but where does that come from? From human persons, robust persons. The seed of the self-destruction of slavery was embedded in the document, even though it would take another a century to eradicate. Even though Jefferson and Washington owned slaves, they wrestled with this. They talked about the problem, the dilemma of liberation before repatriatization, the idea that you can't free the slaves without sending them back to Africa because they're going to do what the French slaves did in Haiti, and that is go bludgeon all their masters. But we can't repatriatize them back in Africa. It's been 2 centuries. They don't understand the language any more than we do. They would die. It was a really hard, convoluted, complicated issue. But the seedbed in the Declaration of Independence, endowed by our Creator, all men are created, the thing, one recent president said. The thing, the Declaration of Independence, we were endowed by our Creator, inalienable rights, equality. Where does that, it comes from God. Now, I'm not claiming Christianity or that America was a Christian nation. Founding documents don't mention Christ in there anywhere. But it was inspired by Christians. How do I know this? Because there weren't any Muslims there. There weren't Buddhists there. There weren't Hindus. There weren't frogs that talked. You can't appeal to the frogs that did it. There weren't Jews that did it. There were a handful of deists. The rest of them were Christians. So it may not have been a Christian nation, it was a social contract, but that social contract, compared to the French social contract, was theistic. It was Christian theistic. It was not by accident, it was part of the DNA. Followers follow. And all those goods, why the West is best, why everyone wants to be like America, from government to hospitality to wealth accumulation to generosity, it's not by accident. Well, let's look at what it would look like by accident. Charles Darwin said, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers. And mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Right, entomologists? I forgot what your name is. That's what would happen. In entomology, you'll have plenty of different illustrations like this. You can talk about lions. A lion comes into the Serengeti, and it's a young lion, takes out an old lion, and what does it do to the cubs? It kills them all. It wants to spread its own seed. Remember the book I mentioned by 2 evolutionary biologists, Palmer and I forget the other one, A Natural History of Rape, a biological basis for sexual coercion? The essence of the book was this: why do we rape? Because our biology makes us do it. Something in our biology. I mean, what else are you going to appeal to? God? There is no God, remember? Something physical has to explain it. And the reason why every strongest male in every population rapes is to perpetrate as many females as possible in order to perpetuate its DNA. Perpetrate in order to perpetuate. So there's one girl in the room there. We have no God. Don't take it personal. It's just spreading our seed. It's just biology. It's just dancing with our DNA, Richard Dawkins says. That's what we would do if we were reared under the same preconditions. There's nothing absolutely wrong with rape. And the guy who wrote 40 books on Darwinism, Michael Roos, 20 philosophical and 20 scientific, said it. Ethics is just illusory. James Rachel's, one of the most classic texts in ethics. I assigned this for 12 years when I taught at IU. created from animals, the moral implications of Darwinism. He said, we are not entitled, not on evolutionary grounds at any rate, to regard our own adaptive behavior as better or higher than that of a cockroach, who, after all, is adapted equally well to life. And Steven Pinker, once again, our brains were developed for finesse, not for truth. This is bad. This has epistemological problems. Because if I evolved and I evolved naturalistically, then my brain evolved. And if my brain evolved, then my logic involved. And how do I know it evolved correctly? And how do I know you're even here right now? If evolution and naturalism are both true, it has the intrinsic defeater of its own system. I can't know that those are true. I can't know that either are true. Alvin Plantinga came up with this idea. He kind of got it from C.S. Lewis. They both really got it from Darwin, who said that the horrid doubt often arises whether the convictions of man's mind is at all trustworthy or valuable, for who would trust in the convictions of a mind, of a monkey's mind, if such a mind had any convictions? In other words, if I evolved purely naturalistically, I can't know that any moral beliefs are true. I can't know that any beliefs are true, even Darwinism. Dawkins, in his most recent book, Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide, whether irrational or not, it does unfortunately seem plausible that if somebody sincerely believes God is watching his every move, he might be more likely to be good. Well, I just have a few slides on this. My forthcoming book has at least 100 pages. Rationality and the rise of universities and science. So I talked about morality and its grounding, not just by accident that the hospitals were in the Christian world, but by essence, by the DNA. Just a couple slides here on this. Man by nature desires to know, Aristotle says in his magnum opus in the Metaphysics. Here's what we've got. Not just, not just Cambridge and Bologna and Paris and the Sorbonne, but in America, Harvard, Princeton, Yale. All of these were founded by Christians very early on. Veritas for Harvard means truth, but not small t truth, big T. They were Puritans. The Puritans founded Harvard. And shortly thereafter, they changed the whole motto to truth for Christ and the church. And it was there almost from 1636 to 1936, 300 years, right until the end of the first ideological revolution, when the scientific naturalists took over in revolution the universities. Right after that, Yale started. And theirs is Lux et Veritas, light and truth. Light represents salvation. And their prodigy that they graduated with, Jonathan Edwards, the great theologian, became a president of Princeton. Over here, De sub numine veget. Under God she flourishes, Old and New Testament on the shield. And then the fourth one, the King's College, otherwise known as Columbia University. I didn't read about this one. I just walked the campus and found it. I have literally traveled to all the colonial schools. And I write about this in my forthcoming book, In Lumine Tuo Videbimus Lumen. I saw this on the bricks. I saw what you're not going to find in Harvard's website. I saw this stuff on the architecture. By thy light, we see light. These places are the most anti-Christian institutions in the world now, with maybe one conservative Christian at Harvard as a token, right? There's Darwin's quote. Sorry, I jumped the gun on that. It was a letter that he wrote. But Tom Holland, who wrote this book, Dominion, he calls himself an agnostic Christian. And he said that every human being possessed an equal dignity was not remotely self-evident to truth. The Romans would have laughed at it. The origins of this principle, as Nietzsche had so contemptuously pointed out, lay not in the French Revolution, nor in the Declaration of Independence, nor in the Enlightenment, Steven Pinker, but in the Bible. He's a historian. In his book, Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. In an article, he said why I was wrong about Christianity. The founding conviction of the Enlightenment, Steven Pinker, that it owed nothing to the faith into which its greatest figures had been born, increasingly came to seem to me unsustainable. Even as belief in God fades across the West, the countries that once bore the collectively known that were once collectively known as Christendom continue to bear the stamp of the 2 millennia-old revolution that Christianity represents. It is why we generally assume that every human life is of equal value. In my morals and ethics, I have learned to accept that I am not Greek or Roman at all, but thoroughly and proudly Christian. As he still can't come over, as Dawkins calls himself a cultural Christian, as Justin Peterson calls himself, or Jordan Peterson calls himself an existential Christian, and as Elon Musk calls himself a cultural Christian. Now seeing revolution number 2 with postmodern cultural Marxism, kicking out the poor naturalists and taking over the universities and the corporate world, and DEI, that applied Marxism and so forth. We have tasted alternative worldviews now. And now even Joe Rogan is saying we need Jesus. I'm serious. Wow. There's a spiritual openness again because Richard Dawkins loves the church bells. He loves the fruit of Christianity. He thinks he can go to the supermarket and just buy an endless supply of apples, juicy, juicy apples. But you can't have the apples, the fruit, without the root. Christianity is the inference to the best explanation. St. Anselm said he paid the debt he did not owe because we owed a debt we could not pay. Anarche anha logos. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We beheld its glory, glory of the only begotten, full of the Father, full of grace and truth. In the beginning was the logic, and the logic became incarnate and gave us hospitals and universities and representative forms of government that assume people are sinners and need checks and balances. The reason why the West is best is because Christ and his movement. Is Christianity good for the world? Is education good? Are hospitals good? Yeah. Is representative government good? Yes, yes, yes. Those things could have been without God. I'm not making the hard claim that God's existence entails them, but as a matter of historical fact, they were not. They came about in connection to Christianity. And it's not ad hoc, it's part of our DNA. We began with a world of mind. There are only 3 worldviews: all is matter, all is mind, or mind made matter. This one is Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. These ones over here are scientific naturalism, atheism, materialism, and pantheism. We discovered all the fountainheads of science, all the major subdisciplines. The founders of each one of them were Christians because we believe in mind. And we are looking at little mind matter composites, and that our sense perceptions are reliable, contrary to Darwin's horrid doubt, because they've been designed to function in the way that they do, and they do it very well. Anyway, I could say more, but I'll stop there and see if you have any questions, because we're way over. We started late on the hour, but we're over.
Anybody have any questions?
Why are you both looking at me?
You're supposed to have all the questions.
Nobody has any?
I did, and I didn't write it down, so now it's.
Well, maybe it'll come back to you. We got 9 minutes. So one of the things I think is interesting about this, and I haven't read Tom Howland's book, but oh, I can't remember the author's name. He's from India, but the book that made your world.
Vishal Mangalwadi.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Says a lot of the same things, hospitals,
Yeah.
literacy, science, all of these things are products of Christ as the foundation of the worldview of Western civilization, as we know it. The question is, in all this, I think, to sort of boil this down concisely, is what do we say when somebody says, what good is Christianity? Why should I become a Christian? What good is it? I mean, what would be your sort of, let's say we're at an outreach table, and somebody wants to have a discussion, we've got, 5 minutes. What would be the elevator pitch?
I would simply say God made you to be in divine human relationship with him. That's where you're going to find ultimate satisfaction and fulfillment. But I don't want to start there if you're not ready for that. I want to show that Christianity is not just good for the world, good for civilization in the here and now, not just in the hereafter, but it's good for the here and now also. And I can show that by simply appealing to, do you think education's good? Yeah. Do you think the universities are good? Yeah. Who started those? Do you think hospitals are good? Do you think compassion's good? Morality? Yeah. Who founded those? Do you think representative government? Why is everyone trying to break down the gates of the borders of America, trying to be like us? What was it that made America special? And at the conclusion of my book, I say MAGA in the morning after. You can't make America great again unless you make America good again. But you can't make America good again unless you infuse it with Christ again. Because that's what made the West best. That's what made America what it was. That was a fundamental difference in America from the French Revolution. So it depends on the person. The elevator pitch is real quick. It's, you were made to be in divine human relationship. And because we were created for that, and yet we fled from that as a race, and there's corruption and sin in all of us, God took on humanity in Christ. And as the great philosophical theologian Anselm said in the 11th century, he paid the debt he did not owe because we owed a debt we could not pay. Now we just need to respond in faith and trust. So there's a simple gospel, but apologetics comes in because they say, well, that comes from the Bible. You want me to believe in the man. Yeah, but the man comes in the book. Yeah, I don't believe the book. Welcome to apologetics, right? What made the West best comes from the Bible. And so you look at Vishal Magawati's book, The Book That Made Your World. Steven Pinker is a challenger to that. Marx and all of his critical theorists right now is a challenge to that. So it depends on where the person is coming from. What are they asking, right? In Ratio Christi, we like to say we have two, quoting Epictetus, sorry about that, quoting Epictetus, the Greek philosopher. Now my wife is calling me, and I'm so stupid with technology, I can't. The Greek philosopher Epictetus says, we have two ears and one mouth for a reason, so that we listen more. Is the person asking on the problem of evil? Great. Do they need a hug? Then Ratio Christi, we give them a hug. Do they need an argument? We are the ministry on campus to give them an argument. Our two squares in the Venn diagram is apologetics evangelism. We're ultimately trying to save the soul first, but some people need reasons. They need people like you to follow the command, not the suggestion. Be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason, for the hope that's in you, and do it with gentleness and respect. The head, the heart, and the hands of Christ. Far too many Christians for the last 100 years, and that's how we lost the university, and I give you 100 pages on how that happens, is we abdicated our role and responsibility in high culture. We abdicated the life of the mind, loving God with our mind as Jesus commanded us, And instead, we just have our hands and our hearts. We have food pantries, and we have skinny jeans and fog machines in our worship services. But we don't think. We want to have thoughtful Christianity, transforming lives on campus today, changing culture tomorrow. So I don't need to be giving someone the ontological argument if they're just saying, how do I have a meaningful life? How do I know Jesus? What's wrong with me? You need to listen more. We need to be good cultural diagnosticians and psychological diagnosticians. That means asking good questions. That's Greg Koukl, right? Socratic evangelism. Jesus did that. Socrates did that. We ask questions. We try to figure out where the person is coming from. They say, well, the problem of evil and suffering. Well, it might not be the intellectual problem they're really dealing with. It might be the pastoral problem. Maybe they need a hug and not an argument. So it's the pastoral rather than the philosophical, the emotional rather than the intellectual problem of evil. It's up to you and it's up to me to find out what that person is really objecting to. If they need to see that Christianity is not good to the world, prove it to me. I've just shown you in one lecture, which, if you need it, I plagiarized 1/3 of my booklet, Is Christianity Good or Bad for the World? Which is also going to be in my forthcoming book that I get from the editor tomorrow. I have a week to get it back and it'll come out in October. So if you missed any of that, you missed any of the quotes or whatever, all that stuff's there for you. You got the Vishal Magawati and so forth. We got to figure out what is the world asking. We have the answers, right? We do have the answers. Christianity is true. And so in the last part, the last 100 pages of the book, I say, what do we need to do to take our culture back? How did we lose America? 100 pages. Well, look no further than the universities. 100 pages. Well, what do we do about this? 100 pages. We need to show that Christianity is good because we're now being told it's oppressive and wicked and villainous, that it's reasonable because religion is believed as the opiate of the masses, the drug for the masses. It's a crutch for weak people, irrational people who need faith, and that it's true. It's good, it's reasonable, it's true. And then a clarion call to pastors, professors, parents, parachurches, philanthropists, political allies, prayers. Don't forget prayer. All revivals, most revivals in the last 500 years happen in connection to college campuses, including the Reformation. Don't skate prayer as part of your Ratio Christi chapter. It's not all about being a robot. We are not Elon Musk on steroids. We are not Mr. Spock. And the people we're talking to have hearts. We're not the Tin Man. Don't do apologetics. Do apologetics evangelism. Get to know the person, personalize, scratch their itch. Where do they itch? They can tell you, and you can help guide them because they may be misled on where they really itch. And if you're asking good Socratic questions, it's going to come about.
Well, speaking of prayer, we are out of time. Would you like to give a short prayer to end our time here today?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you, God, for this time. Thank you for saving our souls, or I don't know all these students, but presenting yourself before them. We pray that you would draw us to yourself. We pray that you would give us equipping that we need, the resources we need to go out and love the world, to know you and to make you known. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, Corey. Appreciate it.
Good to gather with you guys. Blessings. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Corey.